Hello, everyone. My name is Cat Oriel with Forbes Breaking News, and today I'm here with Dave Min, a current member of the California State Senate, who's now running for Congress in California's 47th district in the House. Thanks so much for joining me today, Dave.
Thanks for having me, Kat.
Of course. So can you talk to me about your background and what led you to today running for Congress?
Yeah, so I had a career before politics, and I'll be honest, I was not one of these kids who did Model UN or debate club and ever really thought I'd be in politics. And what I like to tell people is when I was a kid, I was terrible selling those magazines they make you sell. My first job ever in life was selling Cutco knives, and I sold only two sets. One was to my parents, and the other was to their good friends. And that's a long way of saying the last thing I ever thought I'd be doing is getting out in front of audiences, calling people and asking them for campaign donations and all the things that make a politician. But, I have spent my career in public service. My very first job out of law school was at the Securities and Exchange Commission. And this was right after Enron, right after WorldCom, and right after 9/11. And so I wanted to serve my country, wanted to put my legal skills to use. I was a Wharton undergrad. I'd gone to Harvard Law School, and felt like the place to go was cracking down on securities fraud. And from there, I continued on in public service. I worked as a Capitol Hill staffer to Senator Schumer, and then as a policy director at the Center for American Progress before coming back home to UC Irvine to teach at what was then a brand new law school. And I'll just say, in 2016, I testified 6 times before Congress. I was on TV a fair amount on CNBC, Fox Business, things like that. And, I followed politics closely because I was a former staffer, but really saw myself on the policy side of things. And then after Trump actually got elected and did the unthinkable, I found myself catalyzed. And I think, honestly, it's because I'm Asian American. I grew up in this country in California in a time and place when there were not a lot of Asians around. I was the only Korean American kid in my class. And, for me, I think when Trump started going after a lot of different marginalized communities, whether that was different LGBT communities, undocumented immigrants, or Muslims, I know what it's like to feel marginalized, to feel picked on because of who you are. And I think the instinct in me these days as an adult is to want to stand up and fight back. And that is really how I ended up becoming much more politically active than I'd ever been in my life, and somehow ended up running for political office. And I flipped this state Senate seat that I now hold blue in 2020. I won this same area by 5 percentage points that I'm now running in for the Congress, and the first Democrat in modern times to hold this seat. So I think we're in strong position to win. And I know that for me personally, the motivation to be in politics right now is to put this country back on the right track. I'm a father of 3 young kids, Teddy, 13, Emmy, 11, Paxton's 8. And, I want them to grow up in the America that I got to grow up in, an America where we have opportunity, we value things like diversity and inclusion and democracy. And those are not the values I see this country headed towards right now.
Yeah, and you used the word unthinkable. So I was curious, you did expand upon it a little bit. And at first I thought January 6th when you used that word, but and I was wondering if, watching what happened unfold on January 6th, was that the turning point? But it sounds like it actually was a bit, starting in 2016, just seeing everything going on in the state of the federal government, that sort of was the catalyst. But is that a fair assessment, or was there actually a turning point? I'm always curious, what is the moment where you take a look and you're like, I want to do this, I want to run for Congress?
So I'm running for political office is obviously the first step. And I did run for Congress in 2018. I lost in a narrow primary to Katie Porter that year. For me, the catalyst for running was I think it was the Muslim ban back in 2017 when Trump took office. And that had come around the same time as the trans ban. Obviously the attacks on women, the attacks on undocumented immigrants, but seeing that turned into action using the really incredible powers of the executive branch. I have to say, for me, again, growing up as a son of immigrants, I have a certain vision of what America stands for. It's something that I've grown up with, that I love deeply, right? And I think one of the things about Orange County, and this part of Orange County in particular, that is really unique, maybe not unique, but I think important. One of the reasons it's switched so purple is that there are a lot of immigrants and children of immigrants that live in this district. And so, it's 20% Asian, about 15% Latino. We have a lot of people that you would describe as new Americans. That is to say, they came to this country or their parents or their grandparents. But, we have a lot of people out here who really embody the American dream. And I would consider myself in that category. And I think for those of us who feel so grateful to this country for what it has offered, to see a person, Donald Trump, and a movement, the MAGA movement, that so fundamentally is opposed to the values I grew up thinking this country stands on, which includes democracy, which includes the rule of law, which includes a value for diversity and inclusion, boundless economic opportunity. These are the things that America has stood for countless generations, that has drawn so many millions of immigrants to this country. And I believe fervently in these values. And that, I think, is why I was so offended by what Donald Trump did early on, what catalyzed me to action. And of course, January 6th was a horrific event as well. But let's be honest, that is not that surprising given where we've seen Donald Trump take a good part of the Republican Party. This is not the Republican Party from 15 years ago. This is a Republican Party today that has zero respect for the rule of law, zero respect for democracy. And this is a party that once embraced immigrants like my parents and is now turning their back on them. Not worse than turning their back on them. They are actively saying, you are not welcome here. And that is a message that I fundamentally oppose. And it's something I tell everybody in my communities here in Orange County is you are welcome here, that diversity is a touchstone, and that the diversity and pluralism that we represent here in Orange County is the American dream. It is the bedrock of America, and anyone who tries to tell you differently is un-American.
I do want to touch more on your district. What do you think is the greatest challenge facing your district, and what are you hearing the most from your constituents?
Oh, we have a ton of challenges, but again, my district, it tends to be wealthier and more educated. And so one of the biggest things we're facing right now is around rising homelessness and the high cost of housing. And so here, like if you're a single family starter home probably runs $1.5 million. And that just makes home ownership out of reach for so many young people. Seniors are being priced out of this area. And the number one driver for homelessness in California, and particularly in Orange County, is the high cost of housing. So that is something I hear all the time. Having worked in housing finance policy before, I have a lot of wonky answers I could give. But I think it starts with recognizing there is a role for government to play in providing access, facilitating greater supply of housing production, greater inputs into affordable housing, particularly at the low and very low income levels, but also around workforce housing, and to try to address that. Two other topics I hear a lot about are gun violence and women's reproductive rights these days. I think people, even in California, are deeply concerned that Congress and or the courts might continue what a lot of people see as a war on women's healthcare and women's reproductive rights, and keep going further. I mean, the thought a few years ago was that Roe v. Wade was sacrosanct. In fact, I will say, I think 3 of the justices that voted to overturn Roe v. Wade explicitly said before the Senate Judiciary Committee under oath that if appointed, they would uphold Roe v. Wade. They saw it as settled law. And so I think people across the country, but women in Orange County, many, even Republicans, were very surprised and shocked by that. And I think now we're seeing like a secondary effect of that, where so many women and men are just like, I'm awed. I'm very shocked and dismayed by the pace at which so many Republican legislatures around the country are not just going after like early term abortions, but they're now implementing blanket bans. They're criminalizing abortion, even for the health of the mother. And we're just reading these headlines and seeing, I think, a very dystopian America. And a lot of people watched The Handmaid's Tale or read that book. I remember reading it in college and thought, okay, this is a long away, not realistic dystopian future. And now we're seeing that play out very rapidly. And so I know that's very alarming to a lot of people I represent. And then climate, we're on the front lines here in California, particularly in a coastal community like mine, which also has a lot of wildfire risk. We're seeing the effects. I know people are worried about rising sea levels, around the unusual weather patterns we're experiencing. And I'll just say, like, I've got kind of an aging population. And so we have a lot of parents and grandparents out here. And I know that I hear all the time two things. One is around the cost of housing I mentioned. How can my kids afford to live here? And the other is, what kind of planet are we leaving behind for the next generation? And the way I think about it is, if you've got someone that you love, and in my case, I've got 3 kids. If you have someone you love who's going to be alive in the year 2050 or 2075, given the science that we know right now, we have a duty to act with urgency around what is clearly a climate crisis, both to try to move quickly to decarbonized economy, but also to adapt to the changes we know are coming.
Well, that leads to a question that I wanted to ask you to conclude, but since you're bringing it up, I really loved reading that quote on your website about one of your basic philosophies being about long-termism. And I'll read the quote that you had on there. A civilization is great when its elders plant trees whose shade they know they will never sit in. So I think that kind of speaks to your whole philosophy. Where do you think you got that from, that philosophy?
Yeah, so you remember I used to work in financial markets policy, right? And I had a chance to go to Wall Street. I chose the other path, and you can question my judgment because I make a lot less money than a lot of your viewers. But for me, I think where America got off track is that we increasingly emphasize short-term gains over long-term returns. And and we've had different terms for it. We call it financialization of the economy, rewarding speculation. But I think in some ways we got off track because the economic incentives that we put in place really started to emphasize the short-term gain. And I see that by the way, in legislation and policy. One of the laments I have in being a state legislator is that there's a lot of incentives for legislators and policymakers to try to get that short-term headline, but there's not as much incentive to follow through and make sure that your laws are working the way that you want them to work. And we lost that. And I think that in America, when I was growing up, there was a long-term emphasis. Investments in things like education or climate, these don't necessarily pay off right away, but they have long-term benefits. And we remember seeing that from like some of the infrastructure investments we had in the 1930s and 1940s that paid off, massive ROI there. And I think we have to get back to that philosophy, which, is an Asian American philosophy. That quote is Greek, so it's also a Greek philosophy. And it used to be an American philosophy, and we got to get back to that. I think if we want to return to sustained economic prosperity, to a world and a country that, was, and hopefully will continue to be the greatest country in the history of the planet, we've got to start re-embracing that long-term philosophy that I think that quote gets to.
I'm curious about the topics that you touched on. There were 4 key things there. And so if elected to the House, what would your style be in terms of implementing those things? You would have very big shoes to fill replacing Katie Porter, who has always been incredibly outspoken during hearings on those issues and more. So especially if we are to continue with a Republican majority in the House, would you be willing to reach across the aisle to work on those priorities, which, I think many Democrats are aligned on, or would you only be willing to work with Democrats to push more progressive side?
Yeah. So to answer your last question first, of course I want to be bipartisan. And in the state legislature, I have worked with Republicans on leading legislation around small business regulatory reform. Unsuccessfully, I should add, but I've tried, and I've tried to reach across the aisle in places where it makes sense. That being said, I have a little bit of a distaste for what I call performative bipartisanship, which is just being bipartisan so you can say you're bipartisan. It should be around actual tangible results. And so there's probably certain Republicans that I'm not going to ever work with because I don't, I'm not looking to just partner with somebody for the sake of partnering. But if there's shared interests, yeah, it doesn't matter who you are. I want to work with you to try to get stuff done that benefits my district and my vision for what America should be. Now, on the broader question of like, what kind of legislator do I want to be? I often say this, like Katie and I have similar backgrounds, but we're obviously very different people. And just as one example, when she taught at UC Irvine, she taught with a whiteboard, as we all famously know. I taught with PowerPoint. I like those slides. And while her humor is biting and, very sarcastic and funny, I'm more of a dad joke type guy. So there are differences between us that I think you'll see play out should I get elected to Congress. I certainly value the oversight that Katie brings to the table. Given my background in policy development, that's kind of where I want to put my emphasis. That being said, the one thing I want to copy from Katie, just copy completely, is her willingness to be unafraid and speak truth to power. because I think that's missing from Congress right now. There's too few people up in Washington, D.C. who are willing to call a spade. And that is something Katie Porter brought to the table in spades, and that I want to do as well. I think it's important that when we're elected, we're not wallflowers, that we understand we're getting elected to right now fight for our values, fight for the values that I'm campaigning on. And I think that's really, really important at a time when so many people have lost trust in government, in public institutions, and our very democracy seems to be on the precipice right now. I think we need honest brokers who are willing to step up and fight for the values that they're campaigning on. And you will not see me, I've made my mistakes in life. People will disagree with me on a lot of what I've done, but I don't think anyone will ever accuse me of pulling a bait and switch. I am what I am. I will do what I say I do. And that's the reputation I want to bring to Congress.
It would be very entertaining to watch your dad joke PowerPoints. If we're going to miss Katie Porter's whiteboard, at least maybe we might have that. So I do want to talk about your opponent right now, your rival, the front runner for the Republican Party right now is former California State Rep. Scott Baugh. And recent 538 polls are showing Baugh having a slight upper hand. So I just want you to speak a little bit to what makes you, in your opinion, the best candidate over him. And I know we touched a bit about how Orange County and the orange curtain is kind of being pulled back a little bit. And you mentioned that, Orange County in your district is skewing a bit purple, has skewed blue for the first time in, I think, with Katie Porter ever. So how concerned are you that the district does want to swing back to the red side and the Republicans?
Yeah, so a few things. I don't think there's been any new polling since the primary. So I think most of the analyses I've seen have this either as a toss-up or tilt Democrat. And I think that's about right. Katie Porter won this seat by 3 points. And look, I'll be the first to say I'm not Katie Porter. I don't have her star power. But I think I got a few things going for me. First, the swing votes right now in this area are Asian American. And we saw that reflected in 2020 when Michelle Steele, Young Kim, and a guy named Dave Min all won in this region. And we all overperformed our expectations. And that was because we were able to disproportionately perform well with the AAPIs that make up, in my case, 20% of my district. And so that's one thing I have going for me. I think another thing I have going for me is at a time when Republicans are looking to attack us on rising crime and homelessness, I have the backing of law enforcement. And I'm proud to be someone who backs the blue. I'll continue to do that in Congress. And I'm grateful and honored to have the support of police and public safety behind me in this race. And I think that's going to be an important distinguishing factor. I think that the distinctions between myself and Scott Baugh are very clear. This is a guy who has spent some of his life in public service, most of it in the private sector, but all of it trying to exploit government for his personal gain. This is a guy who was indicted for 22 counts of campaign finance fraud, bribery, and related charges during his time as an assembly member and as a lobbyist thereafter. Again, exploiting his office for personal gain. As Republican Party chairman, the party was caught and he was embroiled in criminal charges of illegally re-registering voters to the Republican Party. You want to talk about voter fraud? That's voter fraud. Meanwhile, I've spent my career in public service trying to crack down on the types of corruption and fraud that Scott Baugh represents. I'm someone who I think represents the values of this district. And when we talk about values, I think I mentioned them earlier, but I believe that most people in my district want a vision that is positive, a vision where we are trying to restore, rebuild, and expand the American dream, where we value diversity and inclusion. And meanwhile, Scott Baugh is a guy who has said the biggest threat America has ever faced in its history, bigger than 9/11, bigger than World War II, is quote unquote wokeism, which I take as him basically describing diversity and inclusion, the values that I think are sacrosanct in this country. We have two competing visions right now. One of them says that people that look like me don't belong in this country, that cultures like my Korean culture are not welcome here. And then we have an inclusive vision that values that same diversity. And I think it's very clear that voters in Orange County, we're going to go with the guy that has the positive, inclusive vision for this country and its future, not the guy who represents yesterday's news, who's trying to take us backward to a time when people like me were not welcome, when women's reproductive rights were not sacrosanct and upheld, when we were allowed to gerrymander and allowed to exclude people from voting. That is not the America that I think people want to go back to.
Well, my last question for you, you did touch on a little bit the mistakes that you've made throughout your life and your willingness to learn from them. And almost exactly a year ago, you were cited with a misdemeanor for driving under the influence. I know you did take full responsibility for that in a Facebook post and express your deep sorry and regret for it. So what should voters take away on what you've learned from this, and how can they trust that it won't distract from your work in California and DC if elected?
Yeah, and first I just want to say I apologize to the people of the 47th Congressional District, the 37th Senate District I represent, for that mistake. And I also just want to say, because there has been a lot of gossiping and the otherwise, that mistake was not reflective of who I am or my career. And I'll just say I'm an Eagle Scout. I'm a dad of 3 young kids. I made one very, very dumb mistake in Sacramento one night that will never happen again. And what I would just say is, we all make mistakes. That was a particularly stupid one, and but I also want to say this. I hope that whatever people think of me, they will take away from me the fact that I'm honest, transparent, and will do what I say I will do. And that's been my hallmark as a legislator. It's something I carry with pride throughout my life and my career. I have fought the good fight. I will continue to try to do that. And I think that is the thing that voters should focus on is aside from a single mistake, what are the values this person brings to the table? What are the characteristics of this person's character? And again, I believe honesty, transparency, independence from special interests. These are the things I bring to the table, and I've got a track record to prove it. And I will take that any day over my opponent, Scott Baugh, who, by the way, has not only made one mistake, but many mistakes over his career. And you want to talk about mistakes. I would submit to you that one mistake of the nature I made, compared to 22 counts, including 4 felonies for misusing, abusing office, campaign finance fraud, bribery, and related charges, I'll take that comparison any day.
Thank you so much for your time today, Dave. Is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you would like to touch on before we close out?
I just, the last thing I would say is, bringing it back to the quote, I think right now we are in a battle for the future of this country. And there's local concerns, obviously. What are we going to do around, say, water issues or rising home prices or homelessness? But there's also clearly national implications for this race. Many people believe this seat may decide control of Congress. And that, I just don't think we can underemphasize that at this moment in time. We're seeing authoritarianism and hypernationalism, the values of exclusion and xenophobia and racism dominate throughout the world. We see this whether it's in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and America right now, unfortunately. And I think that we have a choice to make, not just for the local issues that we're discussing, but also for the future of this country. Where do we want to go as a country? And I hope voters will make the right decision, that they will choose me, not only because I think I'm a much stronger candidate, but because at the end of the day, we're choosing hope, the American dream, and democracy over the values that Donald Trump and the MAGA movement bring to the table. And it is hard to divorce Scott Baugh from Donald Trump. And so I just think that, but I hope voters will take that into account as well.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Hey, thank you, Kat.